It's lovely to be here, and I'm sure most of you will be in the service shortly as well, but let me just say it's been a great delight. It was a particular pleasure for me to have a large group that came from the parish here, along with a few visitors nearby, and I think a couple from farther afield as well. And I wasn't quite sure what I was getting myself into with the group, but it was a delightful 9 days we spent together. A great delight to work with Sandy. And then subsequently, just a couple of weeks later, to back up and do a very similar program. This time mostly participants from an Episcopal parish in Germany, such as the complexity of the modern Anglican world, which was led by Barclay Thompson, who told me he taught Sandy everything he knew. And I said, well, that was a lot, so he must be a great train director. So I had the delight of sort of multiple connections with Sandy, but also with here, because I believe Barclay was ordained in the diocese here. So some other connections there which we're lovely to discover as well. Let me just mention two things that are not on the topic. I know some people were keen to get copies of the program book for courses at St George's College next year. I've got about 20 or so of them over here, so I'll just leave them on the front. And if anybody is wanting my business card, so they have an email address to write to me later and complain about what I said or whatever, I'll give you Sandy's address. But I'll leave some of my cards there as well, so that if people are wanting to make contact, it's easy enough to do. These days you just Google anyway and you find the person usually pretty well straight away. What I thought, what time do we need to wrap up? That's the other thing I need.
We need to be walking out at 10:15, so if you wrap up around 10 o'clock or so, then
sure.
There'll be time for questions.
Okay. Well, actually, we'll probably be doing questions all the way through, but I'll try to wrap up so we all wrapped up well before then. What I want to do with you today is spend a little bit of time thinking about scriptures, but at the macro level, not getting down into detail of particular verses or particular historical questions or particular theological disputes, but to think about like the really macro settings we might have as we perhaps not only describe what the Bible means to us, but perhaps if we're wanting to encourage somebody else to take the risk of actually reading this book and engaging with it and using it for more than ammunition for a theological discussion after dinner. The metaphor I'm using is indeed a very Aussie metaphor, and hopefully by now your ears have kind of tuned into my accent. I don't sound quite so strange as I did 5 minutes ago. But as I speak, I'll probably get faster and fall back into stride, so just be patient or throw something at me. In Australia we have, I think you possibly have it here, we have the six-pack. Six-pack is basically a cardboard container with 6 bottles of beer in it. I'm sure other things come in 6-packs as well, but Aussie males only seem to know about beer. It comes in 6-packs. And a friend and colleague of mine one time was going to speak to a men's spirituality class session, and he phoned me or called me by email and asked me for my suggestions for a Bible 6-pack. So because a guy would take a 6-pack when he goes to a meeting. So what would be the 6 most critical, important things one might say to a room full of men, people in particular, generally, about the Bible? So I put a few ideas and sent them through, and that exercise was a useful conversation starter. So I thought I'd use that sort of process with you here today. If we'd had a little bit more time to kind of prepare you for the event, I might have asked you to do some homework and to make your own list of six most important things you think it's really important for someone to understand if they're going to use the Bible for more than a book stand. Okay? So just for a moment, just off the top of our heads, let's just call to mind and make a mental list of what you think I'm going to talk about. I don't think Sandy's given you my list of 6. So if you've got the challenge, you can only say you can have a list of 6 really important perspectives on the Bible that you think it's helpful for someone to have. Only 6? Not 7, not 10, not 12, not 39, good Anglican tradition, but just 6. Obviously some things will be left out. But just take a moment to make a mental list of what you think I might be about to talk to you about. We'll see whether we start anywhere on the same page or somewhere totally different. Just for a moment, just sort of form your own mental list. As you're doing that, what I'm hoping we'll then do is that we will, I'll work through my list of 6, but we'll use them as opportunities for discussion as to why we might think or might disagree that that's a really important attribute. I make no claims that my list is the list. It's simply a list. It's a list that I actually came up with about 10 years ago. I guess if I started again from scratch, I might have a different list. That's okay. But it's a useful exercise in trying to identify half a dozen really significant things about the Bible. Okay? Then you sort of form your own shopping list of what you're hoping I might say or hoping I won't say, as the case may be. Let's see if I still work any better for me if I turn it around the other way. Not greatly as it turns out. Okay, we'll leave it this way. Just bring it around so I can read it. Okay, so it might be helpful if I read all 6 out, so you know where we're heading. And you can either be disappointed with me or excited with me immediately. And then we'll back up and just go over each of them. And we may find that we don't get through all 6. But if in the process we've had 30 or 40 minutes of really good discussion about the Bible, we're all winners. Okay, so there's no kind of, not like there's a set outcome to which we have to get. So let me just read you the 6. The first one that I wrote all those years ago was this. The Bible was mostly written by ancient Jews, a few of whom were followers of Jesus, although probably none of them had ever seen or heard Jesus during his lifetime. I should warn you, I'm a sort of a biblical studies professor at a seminary for most of my adult life, so I can't just have one idea in a sentence. And so as you can see, there are 2 or 3 ideas already packed into that first point. But the first point is the Jewishness of the Christian Bible, not just the Old Testament, the Jewishness of the Christian Bible. Second one, most of the Bible was prepared for oral presentation via live performance in community gatherings for worship and mutual support. And then brackets, and not for close study by literate and highly educated individuals, such as are filling this room here this morning. The last 3 words were not in the list, but you get my point. These were living texts created for a community who told the stories to each other. And they didn't all have copies of Paul's letter to the Romans when they arrived at church in Rome on the first Sunday after Easter. And they went through and they went line by line discussing Paul's syntax and his punctuation and whether he should have used the aorist or the perfect or whatever. So the Bible is basically community tradition prepared and preserved for oral presentation, live performance in community gatherings, and not for formal literate analysis. Thirdly, the Bible has very little to do with history, even though there are some historical elements within it. So that might be one that you want to come back to and talk about. The Bible has very little to do with history, even though some historical elements are embedded within it. Fourth, decisions on which text to include in the Bible were mostly determined by the political needs of Jewish communities after Alexander the Great and of emerging Catholic Christianity in the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era. So the Bible has a political spin to it, would be, I guess, the subtext. The fifth one, while the Bible has been used to validate prejudice and oppression of various kinds, it can also be used in ways that enhance humanity and encourage respect for the earth. That's kind of looking at the baggage that the Bible comes with when you get into a discussion with the village atheist. about what's wrong with Christianity or whatever. And the last one is, that I had on my list, was the Bible is best read in the company of other people so that we benefit from the wisdom of others as we seek to hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. And that's an attempt, of course, to make sure we don't leave God out of our discussion of the Bible and how we use the Bible. So there's the 6 points. Just a quick summary, the Bible was mostly written by ancient Jews. Secondly, it was written for live oral performance, not for literary analysis. Thirdly, it's not primarily concerned about history. Fourthly, the selection of the Bible was done by the political leaders of the Jewish and Christian communities, in particular specific historical times. The Bible has been misused but can be used well, and the Bible is a collective document where together we listen for the voice of God. So that's a heads up. Perhaps the first thing to do is just to check how surprised you are by that list. How does that list sit with you, just as a first kind of reaction? Is it completely different from what you thought I was going to proffer for discussion, or is it closer to what you're expecting? And let's just have kind of comments, feedback. I'm used to doing live classes, so I'll keep an eye on the clock. Sandy will make sure I keep an eye on the clock, and we'll make sure we all get to church. So just off the top of the head, any immediate reactions to, that's the list? Yeah.
I thought the Old Testament had a great deal to do with this.
Certainly has lots of historical stuff in it. Question is whether, so we'll come to that when we look at the specific, but so you would not be surprised that the historicity item would be in the list. But you're surprised that I'm suggesting the Bible is not primarily about history. I'll be saying that the Bible is primarily a community text about God's involvement with the life of the Jewish and then very early part of the Christian community, which are historical developments, but it's actually a text about the story of God with God's people, rather than the story of empires and kings and so on. Someone had a hand out over here. Yeah. You're not at all surprised. But you came this morning anyway. Yeah. Go back in the second, right at the front. Yeah.
Completely different.
Completely different. Okay.
Like you talk about love of God, sinfulness of man.
Okay. I'm talking about the Bible, not about Christian theology. Yeah. So that's okay. That's just me. I mean, I've narrowed it to, if I wanted to talk about what is the Bible, rather than what the Christians believe because they read the Bible, that's another story. But yeah, sure. But that would be a more theological list of 6 very important Christian beliefs, rather than 6 things we might be good to know about the Bible or to think about the Bible. Right down the back there was a hand up as well.
I think that.
Covered? Yeah. Okay. All right. Yes.
Well, I think what you're trying to do, and I appreciate, and sometimes we don't actually think about when we read or talk about, we have to understand where the Bible came from before we can actually understand what's going on. And so this is telling us historical things that can ground us in our knowledge of what's happening and why things were spoken the way they were and viewed the way they were. And I'm like the friend up front who said, of course, 6-pack, forgiveness, hope, love, guilt, sin. I could come up with 6 real quick.
Yeah, well, Paul gives us 9 in Galatians with the fruits of the Spirit. The start is, yeah. So yeah, the idea of 6 is just a little mental discipline to say, let's make a list, let's not spend forever trying to make a complete doctrine of Scripture here. Which, interestingly, the church has no official doctrine about the Bible. It's not part of the creeds. You will find references to what's in the Bible in the 39 articles and so on, which of course are not actually part of the Episcopal Church's formularies anyway. And in the ordination service, you'll find questions being asked of the deacon or the priest about, do you accept all the canonical scriptures as given by God? But we've sort of got to go and piece together from different places what the mind of the church is about the Bible. So again, that's part of the complexity. And yet the Bible is and has been very critical. Perhaps as a precursor to all that, and this really goes to the first point, I guess. Let's take the Jewishness of the Bible for starters. Another way to think about that, and I think it is very important that we actually recognise the Jewishness of the Christian Bible, rather than play another common Christian game, which is to discount the Old Testament and to privilege the New Testament, which means we've put 2/3 of the Bible into a kind of a B team, and we've kept our third of the Bible in an A team. But it's that third of the Bible, to some extent, doesn't make sense without the rest of the Bible. It all coheres. So the Jewishness, and specifically that it was Jewish traditions, not Hellenistic traditions, not Persian traditions, not Egyptian traditions, but Jewish, the very specific and historical Jewish traditions that are shaping the Bible that we have. But the other side of that same reality is that when Christianity emerged as a separate religious tradition, it already had a scripture. It was the Jewish Bible. They didn't, and because the scriptures grew over another couple of hundred years, but the Christian religion as a unique and distinct body of practice and belief, it's been expressed this way: Christianity was born with the Bible in the cradle. The Bible was, in a sense, there before Christianity was there. So that this is part of that first point: the Jewishness of the Bible and the if you like, the chronological sequence between. There has never been a form of Christianity which was not already reading the Bible. I don't want to ultimately privilege the Bible as the only way for us to work out what God wants us to do or think. But there has never been a historical phase of Christianity which was without the Bible. It may not be the Bible with all 66 books, but there's always been a Bible in the corner of the church room, in the corner of the cradle where the church was just a baby. So perhaps let's just take a few minutes to take some questions and discussion around the significance of the fact that the Christian Bible is 2/3 or even 3/4, if you have the Catholic Bible with Apocrypha, 2/3, 3/4 of the Christian Bible are in fact shared with the Jewish tradition. And every single one of the New Testament books is also written by a Jewish person, with the possible exception of Luke and Acts. And if you ask Paul, was he a Jew or Christian? He wouldn't understand the question. But he would say, I'm a Jewish person who has come to know the Messiah. So Matthew, Mark, John, Paul's letters, Hebrews, etc. These are all Jewish texts. And we can have an argument around whether Luke and the book of Acts is written by a Jew or non-Jew. But with that one possible exception, is Luke and Acts are volume 1 and 2 of the same document. All of the New Testament, all of the Christian texts are written by Jews, as well as, of course, the Old Testament texts are written by Jews. Now, for me, that makes a big difference to how I read Scripture. But I'm wondering how that kind of recognition of the Jewishness of our Bible, how that works out in your own approach to Scripture. Any comments or reflections? Yeah.
Well, for me, in my theological and biblical explorations, for years I've had a conflict between the God of the Old Testament, between much more judgmental than the God of the New Testament, which was forgiving and loving. And I said, how can we have these two gods that just all of a sudden, on year 1 of CE, be a different God? And I said, well, God didn't change. People change. And so I developed a speculation, that's all it is that the
I think St. Paul would be on your side of that discussion. But that's more or less the argument Paul develops in Galatians in particular. And we have the first passage of Galatians today. And I guess over the next 4 or 5 Sundays you'll be travelling through Galatians for the next couple of Sundays. And Paul's argument is that the law, the Torah, was needed like a schoolmaster to prepare people for the coming of the gospel. That, of course, is a very pro-Christian way of reading the Old Testament. And it actually still kind of says, actually, we're the real religion. And that other group, the Jewish group, they were just a sort of preparatory class. And we're the senior year. Now, there's a kind of, even there is in that a potential for a kind of anti-Semitism to flourish often within Christianity, of course. And of course, if I'm working with Jewish scholars and so on, and just Jewish believers, they're not going to accept that the God of the Old Testament is not loving and compassionate and merciful. That's what the Exodus story is all about, provided you're an Israelite and not an Egyptian. Okay? Or not a horse serving in Pharaoh's army. My daughters are into horses. And I have a bit of a problem with the God who would drain Pharaoh's horses and all his chariots in the depths of the sea. So so what you're talking about is a kind of using a sort of revelatory, sort of progressive revelation paradigm to try and get a continuity but development from the Old Testament as a block to the New Testament as a block. I guess I wouldn't quite put it in as firmer terms. I would say there are voices within the Old Testament that are more about judgment and so on. And there are voices within the Old Testament that are more about forgiveness, salvation, restoration. And there are also voices in the New Testament that are very judgmental. And the book of Revelation is, of course, Exhibit A. But there are other bits in there. John's Gospel is, even the famous John 3:16, which is the one verse everybody in the room could stand up and recite. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. It means the very same God is going to send everybody else to hell because they don't believe in Jesus. Well, that's not a loving and forgiving God. That's just a pretty dysfunctional God who happens to like me. So we're okay. But what about the people who are left out of John 3:16? They're going to find that kind of God is very judgmental and destructive, not life-giving. So I personally don't. I know the problem. I know the dilemma, and it's a dilemma that Christians have faced since at least the 2nd century. And one of the wrong answers given in the 2nd century by a man called Marcion, who, by the way, has the distinction of being the first official heretic in Christianity. That looks good on your business card. First official heretic. That comes much later. But again, the first official heretic. So what did Marcion do? Well, Marcion said, well, the God of the Old Testament is a different God. He's angry, he's mean, he's nasty, creates problems, and that Jesus came to reveal a different God, and that we should just get rid of everything that's Jewish from the Bible. So his solution was to jettison not only the Old Testament, but everything except the letters of Paul and the Gospel of Luke. Everything else went because it was too Jewish. Now, that was such a shock for the early church in the 2nd century, around about 130 thereabouts, that they not only kicked him out of the church and declared him a heretic, but they quickly started work on deciding what was in the New Testament, what we call the New Testament. And we get the New Testament because of Marcion. Marcion actually edited the first edition of the New Testament, but it only had Paul and Luke. And the early church said, no, you can't get by without Matthew, and we need a bit of John, and so on. So Marcion went too far one way, and then the church reacted, and what we get is the New Testament being included within Scripture. So for many Christians over 2,000 years, the Jewishness of the Bible has been a dilemma. And one of the comforting ways of dealing with it is to say, well, they were plan A and we are plan B. And plan B is the new improved version. That's also what's called supersessionism. Christianity has superseded Judaism, and it's also officially a heresy. And it leads, of course, to Christian anti-Semitism, which is one good reason of not being a real theological space. So it is complicated for us, but one of the things I like about affirming the Jewishness of the Bible is that it encourages me to be spiritually humble. A lot of the wisdom that I recognise as being biblical wisdom and Christian wisdom is actually Jewish wisdom. And I think that's a corrective to some of our patterns of the way we've talked about Pharisees and so on in the church. I think that's a bit of a nice corrective for that. So, just keep in mind things, because time is ticking by. So, well, I'll move on to another one shortly, but in case there's anything else on the Jewishness of the Bible. Yes?
Luke's gospel and the Acts chapter, you mentioned earlier that they didn't fit in the same way others did. I think it has to do with Jewishness, so I'm not sure.
What I was alluding to there is that Luke's gospel has a slightly different voice from the others. Amongst other things, Luke is the only person, the Gospel of Luke is the only document where the author speaks in the first person, in the first paragraphs. That's what he's doing. And other people have done this, and now I'm collecting it all together, Theophilus, so that you've got a correct story and so on. Now, it's not clear, and we've got no way of knowing actually who wrote the Gospel of Luke, the Acts of the Apostles. But in the tradition of the church, that person has often been identified as a Gentile. Now, there's actually no really, really good reason for saying that. There's nothing that's historically, here's the evidence, nobody can disagree. It's two bits of evidence probably are the most significant. The first is it's the best Greek anywhere in the Bible. It's not the best Greek being written in the ancient world, but it's the best quality Greek of anybody writing, translating the Old Testament into Greek or composing the New Testament in Greek. So whoever wrote Luke and Acts had done better in Greek studies at school than Paul did. Okay, so that suggests a more educated, slightly more affluent kind of person, and a person for whom Greek is their first language, not their second language. That's probably the most important bit of information. The second bit of information is that in 2 Timothy, I think it is, Paul refers to Luke the physician. And although Luke and the book of Acts are entirely anonymous, in the tradition of the church, we call it the Gospel of Luke because the tradition was it was written by Luke. And so then it becomes Luke the physician because he's the only Luke mentioned in Paul's letters. That's not really good historical argument, but that's what's happened in the life of our church. And the third thing to factor into it is that in the Gospel of Luke and in the Acts of the Apostles, Luke has a consistent attitude which is interested in the temple and the big Jewish social institutions, but he also sees whenever there's trouble in the book of Acts, it's caused by the Jews. Now that could mean that Luke is not Jewish. So that's kind of the three bits of stuff, people. And because it makes it makes only a minor difference to how we read Luke and Acts. But there are times when it's useful to say, oh, of course, Luke has a slightly different point of view because he's not a native Jewish writer than Matthew or Mark or John or Paul. That's all it was nice. But apart from Luke and Acts, where there's an argument both ways, I've got colleagues who think Luke was actually a Jewish priest. And that's why he's so interested in the temple. But most people haven't brought that argument. Most people, I think, most scholars would say that Luke was probably non-Jewish or even a convert to Judaism later in life. And but the rest of the New Testament and all of the Old Testament are Jewish documents. Anyway, so that's something just to mull over and let that sort of sink in. When we gather in church every Sunday, our Old Testament reading and our psalm, we're drawing on the Hebrew Scriptures. And so there's a sense in which the Jewish faith is the seedbed of the Christian faith. And I would suggest it's really helpful to remember that. Okay. Let's take the second one, but I think we'll probably need to keep some time up our sleeve to talk about the historicity of things. Let's talk about the second one first. What I suggested was, number 2, the Bible was prepared for oral presentation by a live performance in community gatherings for worship and mutual support. So let me just unpack that a little bit. The early Christians did not come to beautiful buildings such as you enjoy here and sit in lovely pews and people on the roster who went up the front and did readings. And they certainly didn't have copies printed out on the pew sheet. Okay. They gathered probably in somebody's family room. If it was a wealthier person, they might have a large courtyard area inside their home structure. And that was the place where these small groups of Jesus people would meet for their weekly gathering, probably on a Saturday night at the end of Shabbat. Again, it's not just that the Bible has Jewish roots, the Eucharist has Jewish roots. The prayer life of the church has Jewish roots. There's nothing about Christianity which does not have Jewish roots. As an aside, that makes it very challenging for a Palestinian Christian. Because they don't know what to do with the Old Testament. Because it's in Hebrew and it's Jewish, and they don't want to go there. And I can understand that, but one of my battles in Jerusalem is that you've actually got to read the Old Testament. You can't just skip it. I know it's Jewish, but you've got to read it. It's part of the package. So when the early Christians gathered for their community gatherings where they discovered Christ was present with them, and they prayed and they shared meals and they gave each other practical help and financial help and so on, that was also the place where they read Scripture. So Bible study was not something you did over in a corner, unconnected from everyday life. Reading the Bible was fundamental to the character and the identity and the belief system of that gathered community of people who drew their hope partly out of the text and partly out of their life together. And that's why these stories were prepared. The Gospels were written so that people in those gatherings could tell the story of Jesus to each other. Because people gathered in Athens had not seen Jesus. So the origin of the Gospel stories is to provide almost like a script for a performance week by week of different parts of the story. Similarly, when Paul wrote a letter, Paul is writing a letter to a small group, in the case of the Corinthians, the community gathered in Chloe's house. Okay? He knew the name of the lady whose house people would be meeting at. He also knew that most of them were illiterate. So what did the person who took the letter have to do? Let's think of Phoebe the deacon, Romans chapter 16. At the end of the letter, Paul has always footnotes. Say hello to so-and-so, ruthlessly, and he commends Phoebe the deacon who's bringing this letter. So Phoebe, a woman deacon from the first century, they did have women deacons in the early church. She's sent to she's sent to perform, do a live performance of the Epistle of Paul to the Romans, for the world premiere performance of the Epistle of the Romans. Nobody else in the room had a copy of the text. She had a copy of the text, and she had to perform it for the audience. And her script had no gaps between the words, no punctuation, and everything in capitals. and she had to go and deliver that communication from Paul. And it's 16 chapters long. And nobody was taking notes, and nobody had a stenographer. Okay? So they were trained culturally to watch, to listen, and to discuss afterwards. Live performance was the medium of communication. And that's where the Bible emerges. The Bible only becomes a printed book after the invention of the printing press. Of course. Okay. Until then, most Christians, right up until there was an economic value in having literate workers, okay, we were thinking well after the Reformation, we think it's always been like this because that's how we know life. Most Christians were illiterate. But there came a point with the Industrial Revolution where it was economically important to have literate workers with basic literacy. Until then, most people could not read and write. So how did they hear the Bible? It was read to them in church. How did they participate in the liturgy? Well, if you get an old Book of Common Prayer, even older than one we used at 8 o'clock, a very old Book of Common Prayer with E on the end of book, things like that, you'll see that it'll have things like, the people will now say the Lord's Prayer, the priest first saying each line, and the people repeating it after him. Because they didn't even assume they knew the Lord's Prayer. The priest would prompt them as to what they had to say. So that's what I mean by the oral nature. Now the texts were written down primarily to validate that what Phoebe was saying was actually what Paul was authorizing her to communicate. Now, of course, the Bible then takes on a life of these letters become significant in other ways. But that's what I'm getting at when I say the Bible was not published as printed text for detailed literary analysis. It was basically the script for a liturgical performance in the community gathering of the disciples of Jesus. So that's a big side, that's a long, detailed side explanation. Again, any comments, reactions to that before we try and do a quick visit to the historical questions?
That being the case, I guess Bible nature begs to be analyzed.
Oh, well, of course it does. In the Western.
Theology is systematic theology. Paul writes to Timothy, he says, study to show yourself approved of God, that you need not be seen rightly applying the word of truth. So that suggests that it should be looked at carefully now.
Yeah, and because already in the Jewish tradition, and we know this for various reasons, perhaps the best example of this are the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in 1947. And there we actually have a community of grumpy old priests who don't like the new prayer book, and have gone off into the desert waiting for their turn to be in charge of the cathedral. Nothing changes in the life of God's people. And what they're doing is they're writing commentaries and devotional studies where they are literally going line by line through the Bible. But this was the scribal elite. These were the priests. And the priests, just like the educated workforce in the 18th century, the priests in the ancient world were useful not because of our religious training, because we could count. Okay? Priests had to calculate the holy days, and they had to watch the moon, and they had to work out the beginning of each month, and the annual cycle of the seasons and so on. And so priests were critical information services personnel for the rulers of the ancient world. And so that's where literacy and the best of the cultural traditions of the ancient world resided with the clergy, who weren't useful for anything else. They didn't farm, but they were the scribes. They were the people that carried the cultural wisdom in terms of literacy and astronomy and astrology and genealogies, and they also did the tax calculations for the king and made sure the tithes came in at the right time. So priests actually had a purpose in ancient society, and they were highly literate, and they developed devotional practices where they went through line by line. which is not what the slave communities of the early Christians were doing. They didn't have those sort of people. So the text becomes, these oral performances eventually move into a non-oral domain, and that becomes critically important for Judaism after the destruction of the temple. Because then gathering to read the Bible, Torah, is the substitute for going to the temple. So, and then you get the emergence of the rabbi and rabbinic law, L-O-R-E, and you get the Mishnah and the Talmud developing. So that a modern Jewish person does not read the Bible, they read the Talmud, which is the commentary on the Bible. And so so then you've got the religion of the book replacing the religion of the temple. But in the first century, Christianity is not yet the religion of the book. It's still the gathered communities of Christ. Let's move on and look at the question of history, because I threw this one in. For me, is an idea I've become familiar with, I guess, over my years as a historian and a biblical scholar. But it's one that sometimes surprises me. This is how I worded it on the document. The Bible has very little to do with history, even though some historical elements are embedded in it. And then I just want to take a 1 or 2 second summary and then open up for a conversation. What I'm trying to say there is that the rationale for what goes into the Bible and the reason for preserving it and using it in the life of the synagogue and in the life of the temple and in the life of the church is not a concern for history, but a concern for the story about God travelling in the company of God's people. So I would say the Bible is about covenant rather than the Bible is about history. And covenant is a way of looking at what happens to us and reading it through the eyes of faith. This is how God is dealing with us. A historian will come along and say, actually the reason that the Jewish people were sent off into exile is because Babylon had a stronger army. And Jerusalem was on the road to Egypt, and it had to be got rid of because the Babylonians wanted to conquer Egypt. And so you could explain in historical terms the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. We can prove the destruction. We can pick up the arrowheads from the tower in front of the city gate from the end of from 586, beginning of the 6th century. But the Bible isn't interested in the geopolitical, historical explanation. The Bible is giving a theological covenant narrative to what happened to the people of God, or indeed to the Jewish people who understood themselves as the people of God. Okay, so I'm trying to keep not just separate, but to keep distinct the historical information which is in the Bible and the covenantal theological framework, which is the reason for the information being kept and read and reflected and commented on and so on for centuries afterwards. So that's what perhaps the other thing to say about that, and this also steps into, consciously or unconsciously, this steps into a historical argument between minimalists and maximalists about the historicity of the Bible. And I'm afraid I might press that button for you when I chose to express it in this way. And essentially a maximalist approaches the Bible with the idea that if it's in the Bible, it happened, unless you can prove to me that it didn't. A minimalist will say, well, the fact that it's mentioned in the Bible is interesting, but can you show me any evidence that it actually happened? Now, there are actually two ends of the same spectrum in terms of historical methodology. What counts as evidence, and what is the methodological significance of a sacred text in doing historical research? I'm in a sense trying to step around that, probably didn't quite manage it. I'm trying to step around and say, well, actually, the Bible is, but maximalists and minimalists, and I would see myself as a minimalist and pushed into the corner, but maximalists and minimalists are actually missing the point of the Bible, which is not to be a historical text, or a scientific text, or a geological text, but to be a sacred text, to be a text about covenants and about people's understanding of their relationship with God. So that's why I phrased it to say the Bible has very little to do with history, even though there are historical elements embedded within it. And that will be enough in some parts of the country to have me driven out of town. I'll never be asked to speak in a Southern Baptist church. But that's okay. I'll be fine. So I'm not sure if that clarifies at least what the issues are in my head around that form of words. Having said that, I'm a great lover of ancient history and biblical history. And as Sandy mentioned, I'm one of the directors for the archaeology dig at Bethsaida, 12 o'clock on the Sea of Galilee. You want to come and get your hands in the dirt and dig up biblical history. I can give you the 1st century, I can give you the 10th century BC. I can give you the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century BC, 1st, 2nd, 3rd century Common Era, and where I'm working is the Mamaluke period, which is the 12th, 13th, 14th century Common Era. So if you want biblical history, come to Bethsaida, we'll give you spade loads of biblical history. But you won't find much about the Bible at Bethsaida, even though it's a town mentioned in the Bible, a village mentioned in the Bible in the time of Jesus, which is why I went there. So it's an interesting circle, how that all works. Okay? So it's coming up to 10 past 10. I'll get my control. Yeah, unless I'm still on Atlanta time.
Yeah, about 3 past 10.
So you're right, 3 past 10. I read 8. I've got my people glasses, not my reading glasses. Yeah, you're right, 10:03. We've still got 5 minutes or so, at least. Yeah.
I find it astonishing Christianity survived as a religion. And I find it astonishing because their faith was in the Messiah, and their Messiah was crucified. And the Romans were after them from their own house. And by 70, they tore down the temple. And so their religion was desolate. What is it that kept that going? I have some speculations, and maybe it's the relationship that we're talking about.
Well, see, I'm going to be deliberately provocative. I'm going to say it was Obamacare. Sam is shaking his head and saying, don't go there. Now, I'm being deliberately provocative because they've got your attention. What did the early Christians have that the pagans didn't have? They had effective social security systems inside their community. They looked after each other. And in the end, the empire needed a community which gave moral fibre and social coherence to an empire that was beginning to fall apart. So Constantine discovered Christianity and gave us the Nicene Creed and various other things. Now, but it's an absolutely fascinating story. Jesus is crucified probably on the 2nd of April in what we call the year 30. Okay, that's my master's thesis. Maybe right, maybe wrong. That's what I did X number of years ago. And it's one of the dates that is mentioned. Almost certainly April of the year 30 and probably April 2nd. Doesn't really matter whether it's 2nd or 7th or whatever. And he's crucified. The fact that he's crucified means he's not killed by the Jews. Note to church history. Christ killers, deicide, whatever. The Romans killed Jesus. He's crucified. That's Roman political execution. And it says straight away, do not go there. These are people to be avoided. If you hang out with these people, we are after you. 300 years later, 325, so 295 years later, the Emperor of Rome, Constantine, convenes the Council of Nicaea to hammer out the draft of the Nicene Creed. What has happened in those 3 centuries? Christians have gone from being hunted, outcasts, to being the social glue that the emperor needs to hold the empire together. And the last thing he needs are the Christians fighting with each other over doctrine. So he gets all the bishops into the room, He puts his soldiers outside, and he says, nobody's leaving here until we have an agreed text. Camp David, Mark 1. Okay? Now, that, in many ways, is the incredible miracle of Christianity. How did it go from being a persecuted minority point of view? But everything Jesus says is perfectly Jewish. We're leaving out John's Gospel, which doesn't have much of Jesus in it, but I mean, there's another one. But generally speaking, what we think Jesus said and did is entirely Jewish, Second Temple Jewish spirituality. Talking about the kingdom of God, calling for people not just to say the words, but to live the words, all this sort of stuff. Healing, teaching, so on. Being angry at corrupt priests, very Jewish point of view, to be angry at corrupt priests. So how did it go from being a persecuted minority voice within Second Temple Judaism, late in the Herodian period, to becoming the DNA of the Roman Empire? That's the miracle of Christianity in a sense.
But for them, for Constantine to do that to have the Nicene Creed, the Christian community had to be a powerful, influential,
It was, and this is what historians of the early Constantinian period or the late Roman period do their work on. What were the social dynamics at the time of the divided empire, prior to Constantine reuniting the empire in 312 in the Edict of Milan? Christianity was still a very minor segment of the population, but they had a reputation of social coherence and moral values and so on, which he desperately needed. The other major contender was Mithraism, and it was a close-run thing as to whether Mithraism, which is Midrash, that's the wrong word came out the back of my head there. The sort of Mithraic cult, which was a Roman soldiers' cult, that had initiation ceremonies, people were baptized in blood, they ate meals together, and so they sang songs about sexy women, probably, whatever, that soldiers do. And that was the other major alternative. Does the empire go with Mithras, or does the empire go with Christ? And Christ won. We will probably never know the exact political and other considerations, but Constantine made a political choice, and he chose Christianity to be the religion he would identify with and that would become the social glue for his empire. He did not make Christianity the state religion. That was Justinian, a couple of emperors later. But he made Christianity a legal religion. Because right up until Constantine, it was illegal to be Christian. So he didn't just go for a small group. Actually, he brought in the outlaws. And he made the Roman Empire great again. But he was building an inclusive society. And Christianity was what he discovered. He couldn't be emperor of Rome without having Christians on his side. And it wasn't because the Christians were in the army, because they didn't serve in the army. So without a sword, Christianity conquered the Roman Empire. It may not have been good for Christianity to do that in terms of our own soul, because we then identified being Christian with being the empire. And we forget there are other forms of Christianity beyond the borders of Constantine's empire, which didn't do it that way. But in the West, Christianity and empire kind of became connected. And it was good for Rome, and it may or may not have been good for Christianity. And that's way off, really, for Bible verse. And I know we are getting very, very close. See, one last question.
You mentioned the political themes affecting the development of the Bible, the books that were selected. Can you talk a little bit about those themes? Also talk about some themes that may have been missing from books that were excluded.
Sure. Partly, it's part of what I've just been talking about as it happened, so thank you for bringing you back on the topic. That's good. Excellent. In terms of the Jewish part of the Bible, you've got the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures. The closing of a canon, as we call it, is a decision made by Jewish religious leadership around about 100 CE. So it actually reflects the competition that was beginning to become problematic between the Jesus people and the synagogue people, what we would call Christians and Jews. The Christians were using, as other Jews were, the Christians were using the Greek translation of the Bible, called the Septuagint, which had another 12 or 13 books which were not in the Hebrew version. And that's why the Catholic Bible is different, and the Greek Orthodox Bible, and indeed the Anglican Bible, is different from the Protestant Bible, or different from the Jewish Bible, because of those differences going back to the Hellenistic period. So the formation of the Jewish canon with its 22 books and so on in the Hebrew version is because of the politics around the collapse of the temple and Jewish people having to renegotiate how they fitted into the empire. And that had been an issue from Alexander the Great onward with the Maccabees and various other things. Fast forward to the 2nd, 3rd and 4th century, which is basically from Marcion to Constantine. So it's in that period between 130, when Marcion is doing his stuff, to 325, Council of Nicaea. That 200-year window is when we get the New Testament. And one of the things Constantine did at the end of the Council of Nicaea, he had 50 copies of the Bible made, handwritten, all in Greek, and he gave them to his 50 favourite bishops in the empire. And one of those may be the Codex Sinaiticus from St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai, which is the only physical book to have survived from the Roman Empire down to our day. And it's a Bible, which is pretty interesting for someone like me as a Bible scholar. So we know that by around about the 2nd or 3rd decade of the 4th century, they'd worked out what was in the Bible. We know that around 100, they were still haggling with the Jews and each other as to what goes in, what goes out. There is a whole collection of Christian literature called the Christian New Testament Apocrypha. Famously, things like the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Mary, a couple of years ago, the Gospel of Judas. The Gnostic documents that were discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1948 actually gave us an ancient Christian library, more or less parallel to the Dead Sea Scrolls, found 12 months apart, both in dry desert areas, one in Israel, actually one in Palestine, and one in Egypt, because we're talking 1947. Now, we can now see that there was actually, and we can also see the very earliest canonical lists of the New Testament include books which are not in our New Testament. So the Epistle of Barnabas, the first letter of Clement, and the Shepherd of Hermas, and sometimes the Gospel of Philip or the Gospel of Thomas, but certainly the first three that I mentioned, are included in what's called the Muratorian fragment from around about 200 CE. So in that list of the canonical books, it has all the books we recognise, but it also has 1 Clement, Shepherd of Hermas, and the Epistle of Barnabas, which eventually are not there 100 years later. So somewhere between 150 and 300, there's a filtering process. And the filtering process is basically the political needs of the bishops of the emerging Catholic Church. I don't mean Roman Catholic, which is Catholic meaning not Gnostic, not Marcionite, but the Catholic Church of the Mediterranean world. So that's one of my favourite areas. I'll avoid saying much more because we'll never get to church, but that's the kind of space. So, for instance, there are something like 30 surviving Christian Gospels from the first 300 years after Jesus, but only 4 of them are in the Bible. So 26 of them got left out. And there were probably others that have just been totally lost. And left out for actually pretty good reasons. I mean, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't put the gospel film or something back into the Bible.
Great, thank you so much.